Enough time had passed to make even the most painful memory of senior year a distant blur. I have done everything in my powers to keep it that way. I have visited countless therapists and hypnotists and even moved to the other side of the globe just to keep the memories at bay. For over a decade, I had managed to not think about her, but the moment I saw the name on the package, all the memories rushed back into my skull with the tenacity of a migraine. From Grace Morgan, the wrapping paper read in big blocky letters, "Your ex-lover," clarified a small scribble below, as if I could forget.
Dear Pete, haven't thought about you in a really, really long time, but I heard you got married. Congrats. Also hear you guys are expecting. So much for it should be a punishable crime to bring another sentient life into this world, huh? Oh, high school. Congrats on the kid. So, since you're all hitched up now, I just wanted to pop in and say goodbye. I read an article about how a lot of marriages these days are broken up because it's so easy to just hit up an ex. Just wanted to cut off that temptation for you. If you ever find yourself reminiscing on the nights we spent together as kids, don't. You have a wife. Anywho, just so you know, you're not allowed to write to me when you get lonely. Have a great life. Gracie. P.S. Baked you and yours some gingerbread men. Enjoy!
2 figures of blue pinstriped suits and bright red frosting sit on my table. The gingerbread men have roughly drawn smiles of frosting and dull silver candies for eyes. They sit on my table and I watch them with fear. Before I dated Grace Morgan, I loved Laura Miller. Laura was my first real taste of emotional intimacy, and for the longest time, I was certain she would be my last. We knew each other since we were kids, but we didn't start dating until we were 16. From the night our friendship turned into something more, we were inseparable. Her parents weren't big fans of me, or for any teenage boy interested in their daughter for that matter. Laura's father would drop her off at school early in the morning and then pick her up right after her extracurriculars. Our love, however, snuck past his vigilant eye. For all he knew, school started about an hour before our first homeroom class, and for all he knew, his daughter had a plethora of vague after-school activities which kept her in school well into the late afternoon. I think Laura's mother might have suspected that her daughter was stretching out her schedule to spend time with a boy, but if she did, she never interfered. By the time we reached senior year, she would call me hubby, and I would call her wifey. I had no doubt in my heart that we would eventually make those nicknames a reality. For what it's worth, I don't think Laura had any doubts either. We were young and in love and bursting at the seams with hormone-fueled happiness. But then, one Wednesday morning, Laura missed our early rendezvous. She didn't come for homeroom or any of the classes, and she was nowhere to be found when after-school activities started. This was back before the days of smartphones or social media, but I still had a flip phone that I tried to contact Laura with. She didn't answer any of my texts, and all my calls went unanswered. When I got home that day, I saw no other choice than just to hope that she would show up in the school the next morning. Yet, the longer I sat alone, the longer I tried to come up with an explanation for why Laura would miss school without any warning, the more uneasy I got. A part of me was worried that someone from school had contacted Laura's parents about our relationship and that her father would lock her in her room until a suitable husband would be found. I knew the man had a short fuse. When the sun set, I hopped a bus to Laura's neighborhood in hopes of throwing a pebble or two at her window to make sure she was okay. There was no car in the driveway. Her house was completely dark. No one was home. The thought of Laura's father finding out about our relationship wasn't pleasant, but I started to hope it was true. I started to hope it was true because in the pit of my stomach, I felt an eerie certainty that something much worse had happened. It wasn't until homeroom the following day that I found out what happened. Mr. Algar, our biology teacher, came in to tell us the news. Algar was a shrewd old man who was famous all across the school for a breed of academic strictness that bordered on sadism. When he came into our homeroom that morning, however, his shoulders slumped and his voice lacked all authority. "You might be wondering why our classmate Laura has been missing for the past 2 days," he said. He was saddened to announce that she would not be coming back. Laura Miller was dead. She had fallen sick with stomach problems on Tuesday night and died on Wednesday. Her parents requested the service remain family only, but the school counselor was available to help process feelings during lunch break. Past the silence of the room, I could hear a hush of an incoming faint. I excused myself and made for the bathroom. No one stopped me, not even Mr. Algar. The mere act of walking was a Herculean task. I kept on trying to catch my breath, but I couldn't. By the time I managed to hide in one of the stalls, the world was nothing but a curtain of static. I don't know whether I actually fainted or how long I spent in that horrible fugue state. Time had lost all meaning to me. Life had lost all meaning to me. I just sat in that stall with my head cradled in my hands, trying to convince myself it was all just a nightmare. I don't know how long I sat there, but I recalled a voice that convinced me I wasn't dreaming.
Laura really cared about you. We were working in our bio lab on Tuesday, and she wouldn't stop talking about how much she loved you and how the two of you were going to get married. I'm so sorry for your loss.
It was Grace Morgan. She'd always sit in the back of the class and kept to herself. If it wasn't for the occasional class presentation, I wouldn't even recognize her voice.
I didn't know she was sick. When I left her house, she seemed fine. When we were finishing off the lab, though, she told me that if anything happens to her, she would want you to be happy. Maybe she knew. Maybe Laura knew something was wrong, and she wanted to make sure you could move on.
When Grace said that to me, I got angry. I yelled at her to get out of the boys' bathroom and leave me alone and never speak about Laura again. In that moment, with my face wet with tears and cold sweat, I thought Grace was talking about Laura to console me. I thought she was trying to help. She wasn't. Now, years later, I know she wasn't. I did not cope with Laura's death well. Initially, everyone around me was understanding. My parents pulled me out of school for the next 2 weeks. My teachers, even Mr. Algar, extended all my assignment deadlines, and eventually, all of them, excluding Mr. Algar, gave me automatic A's for whatever work was due. For the first few weeks, everyone was beyond understanding. The loss I suffered, however, would take much more than a few weeks to mourn. Sitting in class was never my strong suit. After Laura died, each minute spent behind my desk was agony. I'd inevitably start to daydream, and each and every fantasy took me straight back to her. It was hopeless. Only place I found any solace in were video games. Both my parents worked, so sneaking back home wasn't an issue. Classes were crowded enough to only have one round of roll call during homeroom, so I managed to keep perfect attendance as well. The few tests and presentations I showed up for went poorly, but I was still somehow managing to coast above failing grades. I didn't wonder why I was still passing my classes, even though I was never around to hand in an assignment. I just presumed the teachers were inflating my grades out of pity. I was far too busy playing World of Warcraft to question anything about my life. Decades later, you'll hear folks sing the praises of how they love the communal aspect of the game, but I didn't interact with a single player. I sat behind that computer and clicked away hours of my life because some primitive part of me liked watching the numbers go up. I hoped that if I sat behind that computer for long enough, I would grind away at whatever part of me was making it impossible to move on. That didn't help. It just made me more miserable. I stewed in my pit of digital misery until one day, someone rang my doorbell. I wasn't meant to be home, so I turned out my headphones and continued gaming. The bell went off a couple more times before it finally quieted down. About an hour later, when I was raiding the fridge downstairs, I noticed an envelope slipped under the front door. "From Grace Morgan," read the top of the envelope in big blocky letters. "Your classmate," clarified a small scribble below. Inside the envelope was a short note written in rushed hand. Grace said that she missed me in school and that she hoped I would come back soon. She made me something and wanted to give it to me personally, but since I wasn't answering the door, she left it on the front porch. She hoped a bird wouldn't get to it before I did. On the other side of the door, there was a chocolate-glazed cheesecake. There was no sign of any birds getting to the cake before I did, but I was reticent to touch the cake regardless. I didn't know Grace. Aside from the one strange conversation we had in the boys' bathroom the day Laura died, I couldn't recall any other interaction I had with her. The thought of eating the cake definitely gave me pause, but my fridge didn't hold anything appetizing, and I hadn't eaten lunch. After long deliberation, I cut off a small, cautionary slice. It was delicious. It didn't take me long to eat the whole cake. The next morning, when I came to have my head counted during homeroom, I found Grace waiting for me in front of the school. I wasn't in much of a conversational mood, but I did feel like I owed her a thank you. She was overjoyed to hear that I enjoyed the cake and, past my protest, she promised she would bake more. I don't recall doing so, but I must have mentioned that I was spending a lot of time playing World of Warcraft. That's the only explanation I can come up with for why, around an hour after school let out, I bumped into Grace's digital avatar in the realm of Azeroth. I had spent an inhuman amount of time building up my character over the past couple of months, but Grace, seemingly unfamiliar with the game, was a higher level than me. I tried questioning her on how she made so much progress in such little time, but Grace seemed wholly uninterested in talking about video games. She just wanted to make sure I was okay. Conversations about my mental state in person were far too much to handle at that point. When they were abstracted through digital avatars, however, I found myself a lot more talkative. My orc warrior told Grace's dark elf huntress that accepting Laura's death was beyond difficult, and that without her, life lost all meaning. It felt good to talk about it, even if through the keyboard. What felt even better, what made me feel truly seen, was how Grace responded. She, once again, talked about how much Laura spoke of me during their shared biolab, and then Grace talked about a tragedy of her own. Grace never knew her dad, and when she was in kindergarten, her mother died of a sudden heart attack. Grace knew the pain of sudden loss well, and, unlike me, her loss sent her down the rough path of orphanage and foster homes. For the first time in a long time, I was able to pry myself away from my own tragedy and feel empathy for someone else. I listened to Grace's story, and, when she was done, I asked her how she was able to stay so well adjusted. She told me about Candyland. After Mother had died, while Grace was being thrown around our great nation's orphanage system, she escaped to her own private world of imagination. It was childish, but daydreams about Candyland's frosting-tipped skyscrapers and its candy-coated inhabitants gave Grace a place where she could mourn and heal on her own time. The journey had not been pleasant, she said, but years later, she knew that her mother would be proud of her. She always wanted her daughter to follow her dreams, and now that Grace's foster parents owned a bakery, she was able to make all the sugar-covered treats she could hope for. It wasn't just Grace's mother that was looking down at her in pride, though. The inhabitants of Candyland, Grace claimed, were also proud of how she lived her life. It was nice to finally speak to someone about the pain I was feeling, even if through the lips of a pixelated ogre. Talking to Grace felt nice, although the way she spoke about Candyland was somewhat unsettling. She described it at length, as if there were a real city made of candy that she would regularly visit. Her fixation on the made-up place was strange, but I was not one to judge. In a way, World of Warcraft had become my own personal Candyland. The digital landscape of Azeroth felt infinitely more real than anything else in my life at the time. In comparison, Grace's obsession with a made-up place filled with smiling gingerbread men and clouds of cotton candy seemed perfectly normal. Back then, nothing about Grace seemed dangerous. Over the next few weeks, we became friends. At first, our friendship was purely virtual, but as time went on, I found myself hanging around school well after homeroom. Grace always knew how to cheer me up from my depressed states, be it with one of our many inside jokes or with baked treats she would bring every day. She quickly went from someone I barely noticed to my best friend in school. I got along with Grace, but the rest of my high school social life had taken a dive. In general, my classmates were nice and understanding of my sorrow, but among the cafeteria cliques, a nasty rumor had started spreading about how Laura had died. People would whisper, that she was poisoned and that the person responsible for her death was none other than me. Apparently, I killed Laura because I didn't want to go through the awkwardness of breaking up with her. Apparently, I killed Laura so that I could start dating Grace. When the whispered rumors started gaining in volume, I retreated back to my digital nest. But Grace coaxed me out of it soon enough. There was no truth to those rumors, she said. I shouldn't let other people make me feel bad, she said. I had her, after all, she said. Even though I did none of the homework and handed in none of the essays, my grades didn't suffer. In fact, I even got congratulated on an essay well written by the occasional teacher I would pass in the hallway. I wrote no essays, but I didn't question the compliments. I had other things on my mind. The one class where I was failing behind was Mr. Algar's biology class. Mr. Algar would often keep me after class and ask extensive questions about the homework assignments. My essays, the same essays I had no memory of writing, were apparently very different from the ones I handed in last year. When I wasn't able to answer any of his inquiries, he started to ask me personal questions about how I was coping. In retrospect, the old man probably just cared about his student. He wanted to make sure that I was actually learning in his class and handing in my own work and not sliding into some grief-fueled cycle of self-destruction. In retrospect, the old man probably cared. But back then, in high school, Mr. Algar was just an archetypical villain. To my teenage head, he wasn't trying to help. He was just flexing his authority over me. My relationship with Mr. Algar was on a steady decline, but it wasn't until a week before final exams that it reached a breaking point. Right after homeroom, Mr. Algar pulled me out of math class and summoned me into his classroom. When I got there, Grace was already sitting behind his table, crying. That week, we were meant to turn in an assignment concerning the Krebs cycle, Mr. Algar said. The assignment that had been turned in under my name had the same exact mistakes that the paper of Miss Morgan had. In fact, on closer inspection, all of the assignments that were turned in over the past months had the same exact mistakes Miss Morgan's papers had. I had suspected that Grace was helping me out with my assignments, but it never came up in our conversations. It wasn't until we were sitting in that classroom that she confessed. Through a flood of tears, she told Mr. Algar that she had been turning in assignments under my name. She knew academic dishonesty was bad, but she felt for me. When she was young, she said, her mother died of a sudden brain hemorrhage, and Grace knew what it was like to lose someone you deeply cared about. Grace begged for forgiveness, and when Mr. Algar's eyes suggested none, she begged that only she be punished. I knew nothing of the academic dishonesty, she said. I could not be blamed. Grace's plea seemed to have the slightest bit of effect on Mr. Algar. At the start of the meeting, he insisted that we were both going to the principal's office and would be disciplined before the day was done. But after Grace's tear-filled appeal, he said he would take the weekend to think it over. Mr. Algar showed mercy that day, but we were teenagers unable of comprehending it. The moment we got out of earshot, we were both calling him every insult under the sun. Who was he to try to prevent us from graduating? Over the weekend, I feared for the worst. I feared that my parents would be called in, that I would be suspended, that I would have to redo senior year. Turns out, I had nothing to fear. A substitute teacher taught us biology on Monday. The same teacher came in for the rest of the week, bearing little information about where Mr. Algar had gone. It wasn't until Friday assembly that the students were informed what had happened. Mr. Algar had fallen sick over the weekend and had spent the past few days in the hospital. He would not be returning. Mr. Algar was dead. It wasn't until after the assembly, when I saw how wide Grace's smile was, that I started to suspect something was wrong. I had my suspicions, but I made an effort to not pursue them too far. Along with Mr. Algar's departure, all of my fears of expulsion had disappeared. In fact, when exam season came around, Mr. Algar's death proved to be quite convenient. Whoever was marking the papers instead of him was beyond charitable with the grades. I didn't do well on my final exam, but I did pass. I guess, in a way, I feel like I owed Grace. She was the only one checking up on me after Laura's death. She had covered for me on all of the assignments I had missed, and she fed me all those delicious cakes. I guess, in a way, I knew she was also responsible for Mr. Algar being out of the picture as well. She was the one who brought up the idea of dating. I was beyond emotionally unavailable, but I guess, in a way, being with her felt like I was paying her back. It wasn't until a couple of weeks before graduation that I realized just how involved Grace was in the events of the past year. We went to prom together, but we didn't stay long. Right at the start of the event, our graduating class was treated to a montage of photographs set to Green Day's Time of Your Life. The moment pictures of Laura and me appeared on the screen, I couldn't bear to be in that auditorium. Grace was more than happy to make an early exit with me. I wanted to go home. I wanted to be alone and melt my brain to World of Warcraft and not think about the girl I had loved so dearly. Grace, however, insisted that we first drive to a local makeout spot. I was definitely not in the mood, but I took her there regardless. We did, after all, only get one prom. The mood was a far cry from romantic, but as Grace tried to console me, the atmosphere in the car shifted to something wholly different. She said that it was natural to still feel strong emotions half a year after losing a loved one. When her mother died to that drunk driver, Grace said, she was scared of cars for years. There were always inconsistencies in her stories. Maybe I noticed them before and willfully ignored them, or maybe I was too absorbed in my sorrow to see the signs clearly. But that night, in that car, they became unavoidable. I asked Grace how her mother had died. Was it a heart attack? Was it a brain hemorrhage? Was it a drunk driver? For the briefest moment, all the warmth drained from her face. In the dim light of the far-off street lamps, I could see her pupils turn to two hateful pins of black nestled in a pale sea of blue. Then, with a couple of blinks, her eyes turned wet. She would never hurt me, she said. She had loved me ever since elementary school and learned my handwriting and bought a World of Warcraft account online to spend more time with me and stood up for me whenever people would suggest that I had something to do with Laura's death. She loved me, and she was so happy we were finally together, and she wanted me to know that she would never hurt me. I asked, again, how her mother died. She blinked again, shedding a couple tears and all the emotion out of her eyes. In a low, husky voice, Grace told me that her mother wasn't a good woman. She was a religious zealot that controlled every aspect of her life and considered everything to be sin. Toys were sin, dinosaurs were sin, video games were sin, sugar was sin. Grace's mother was a tyrant that needed to be overthrown. Grace couldn't do so on her own. She was just a little girl back then after all. Grace couldn't get rid of her mother alone, so she had some help from her friends in Candyland. In an oven, she brought her friends to life, and they, as a show of thanks, took care of the tyrant. I asked if her friends from Candyland also took care of Mr. Algar. Not hiding her pride, she smiled and nodded. Yes, she said. It was thanks to her friends in Candyland that we both managed to pass biology and avoid expulsion. She baked Mr. Algar some gingerbread men and delivered them to his house during the weekend. He thought they were a peace offering. In reality, they were a Trojan horse. The moment she confessed to Mr. Algar's murder, I knew exactly what else she was guilty of. The words got stuck in my throat, so I simply drove. As Grace pulled at my shoulder and insisted I stop the car so we can calmly talk, I drove. I drove Grace back to the bakery in which her foster parents worked, and it was only once I stopped the car that I asked the question that had been tearing away at my sanity. I asked Grace if her friends in Candyland had anything to do with Laura's death. She gasped. She gasped in the most theatric, practiced way a person could gasp, and then she vehemently denied that she had anything to do with Laura's death. She said her and Laura were best of friends and that she would never harm her. She also knew just how much I cared about Laura, and she would never do something to hurt me. Grace swore up and down that she had nothing to do with Laura's sudden death, but she was a bad actor. I asked her to get out of the car. She refused. I asked her to get out of the car if she really loved me. The moment she was out the door, I sped off. I never saw Grace again. Never answered the door when she rang, and I threw out all of the cake she left on our porch. When graduation came around, I went off to visit my cousin in Europe and took my diploma in the mail. The method through which Grace dispatched her victims was a mystery to me, but I wasn't willing to take any risks. What was meant to be a 2-month Euro trip ended up being a permanent move. I didn't want to go back home. I didn't want to go back to the place filled with memories of Laura. Most importantly, though, I didn't want to see Grace ever again. It took years, but I found some semblance of normalcy overseas. Therapists and hypnotists and self-help books have helped me make peace with Laura's death, but the question of Grace Morgan and her methods of murder forever eluded me. Instead of facing them, I elected to forget. For years it worked. For over a decade, I had managed to not think about Grace Morgan, but now, as I sit here next to the package of gingerbread men, I find myself thinking about her again. 2 figures of blue pinstripe suits and bright red frosting sit on my table. The gingerbread men have roughly drawn smiles of frosting and dull silver candies for eyes. They sit on my table, and ever so gently, I can see them move.